Ashley, I know this is, when a story takes a turn like that, all of a sudden, a lot of attention, and now we're talking about investigating forensics and everything else. And I believe you had an opportunity to speak with a good friend of ours today about all of this.
I did. Joseph Scott Morgan, who is, well, if you watch any kind of true crime, you know who he is. He's a certified death investigator. He's a professor of forensics at Jacksonville State University, and he's super duper smart when it comes to all things analytical when you come to a crime scene. And because of the conversation, Vinny, that you and I had last night about the potential for the remains to have been burned due to the witnesses around that property saying they'd seen bonfires, I took a deeper dive with Joe Scott. And I asked him, tell me what you see when you look at this crime scene, inch by inch by inch, and specifically that fire ring. And wow, did I get a lesson. I want you to have a listen.
Joe, give me your overall impressions when you first saw the aerial view of this crime scene.
Just based on the aerial view that I saw, it was striking by the virtue of the fact it's in the middle of the field and there was no other where that someone had dug. They were specifically in one location, Ashley. All of the investigators were right there, concentrated on that one focal area, trying to exhume anything that was there and try to recover any kind of evidence.
They knew what they were after.
They specifically did. They knew what they were showing up for. They were prepared when they got there.
So you think they knew exactly where to go, and it's no small surprise that that they only dug in one spot. You think maybe someone had told them what they needed to know?
My thought is that there's any number of ways they could have come to that point. I think one of the most glaring things was the fact that they could have used a cadaver dog out at this location, and maybe the dog alerted. Remember, these dogs, you know how they talk about how we have kind of a spectrum of vision, you know, as human beings. Dogs actually have kind of this pseudo spectrum of smell. And this dog is specifically trained. If that dog went to that area and what we refer to got a hit on that area, they would mark that spot, come back out and begin to excavate it. And if we're talking about where two bodies have been deposited, okay, there would have been a concentration of the scent that the dog just couldn't get away from. I mean, it's stimulating for them. The other thing that was kind of rattling around in my brain is, did somebody have specific knowledge of this area that maybe at some point in time spoke with the police or the prosecutor and said, hey, look, you know, I have knowledge of this. Maybe I heard something. Maybe I saw something. Maybe I was there. And this is where you can look, because this is the thing about it. It is so very specific. And what if they have a search warrant that says, we have reason to believe, and they're saying this to the magistrate or the judge that they're trying to get to sign off on this thing, that there are human remains buried immediately adjacent to what's referred to as the fire ring or the fire pit and out back of the barn in a specific location.
You mentioned, you know, did somebody who was there say something? There are so many people who possibly could have, right? First of all, it's very, very close to the road, so there could have been someone who drove by who thought it was odd at the middle of the night to see activity out there. Perhaps it was Tammy Daybell before she died, because those kids went missing before she died. Perhaps it's one of the two who everyone suspects may end up being charged with further charges in this case, and that's Chad and Lori. Perhaps it could be the kids, Chad Daybell's kids, who live across the street and are in and out of that house as well. So there's no shortage of people who could have seen something and perhaps said something. But what I'd love you to do, Joseph, is with your vast body of knowledge of these forensic sites and having visited so many of these sites as well, while they're actually being excavated. Walk me through the photograph that shows the aerial view of not only that fire ring that you talk about that's so close to where the excavation site is, but everything that's all surrounding it, all the specifics, and tell me what those things are.
For me, when I began to look at these, we had several iterations of these photographs. I think the first generation kind of came from a helicopter that was flying over, and you can see there's a progression in time where the landscape kind of changes, and you see tents begin to pop up, and you see actually in a couple of them, there's actually a backhoe out there where they're doing the initial dig. And in the initial appearance, it doesn't look the same as it did at the beginning. They're starting to kind of disassemble it. In one image, you can actually see two investigators actually picking through the area that is the fire ring. The logs have been moved out of the way. It appeared to be logs outside of the fire ring that people could sit on. They've been moved out of the way. Now you've got investigators that are in there. Then you go over to the main excavation site, and I don't want to say how many feet it is, but I'll say that it's within 20 yards of the fire ring, safe. Move over to this large area where there are multiple personnel that are literally down in what appears to be an excavated pit. You can see that there are buckets of dirt. There's multiple buckets of dirt. These are these white plastic buckets, and kind of let me paint the picture as to what's happening here. Every time a shovel goes into the ground in one of these locations, that shovel contains the most valuable piece of evidence that you have at that moment, and that is that dirt. It goes into a bucket. That bucket is then taken over to a separate processing area where it's screened. And I'm sure that a lot of our viewers are very familiar with how forensic anthropology works in the field. And we'll take that dirt and put it through a sifter, and everything that falls down, the tiny, minute things are what's left behind are actually pieces of evidence. Things we'd be looking for are bullet fragments, bits of metal, bone, even buttons, zippers, anything like this that is going to have some type of evidentiary value. And you have to be able to set why it's important to have a forensic anthropologist out there. First off, not everybody recognizes skeletal remains. Sometimes it just looks like a rock to other people, but for them, they can recognize it. And I can almost guarantee there were one of these individuals at the scene. So they're trying to bring up anything that is going to give us information about the remains that they find in this area. And it is tedious, but you want the tedium. You want the attention to detail because, as you know, it's in the finest detail that the whole case can be lost.
So what are some of the other interesting areas around that photograph that to the untrained eye, it just looks like gear? But what's going on?
There are multiple locations that they have set up at the site in order to essentially process this evidence that they're recovering. And probably one of the most heartbreaking things to me is that you can see two separate areas. There's like two separate tarps that are on the ground. They're blue. My thought is that each one of those tarps is used for separate remains. But one of the things that happens is called commingling. So you want to be able to keep the remains separated. You're going to have, unfortunately, JJ's remains and you're going to have Tylee's remains. And so you want to try to keep them separated because at this point, this is a homicide investigation. And everything that comes out of there, including the bodies and all of the injuries associated with those bodies, Ash, that's a body of evidence that you can't get past and you can't dismiss and you can't take lightly.
Was there any equipment that you noticed that the layperson wouldn't recognize?
In the earlier iterations of the photographs, I could have sworn that I may have seen ground penetrating radar out there. For people that haven't seen it, these devices, they kind of look like an old-fashioned real lawnmower that has a handle that comes up, you hold, and it's generally got an electronic box on the front of it, and you push over the area, and it can give you an indication if the soil is like truly disrupted below the visual spectrum. And it can also give you the topography beneath the soil. So if it kind of undulates, you can actually pick up on an image sometimes when this is read back that you have a body, for instance. You can pick up on the outline of a skeleton in there. And this goes to documentation. It's almost like a photograph because if you capture that, that can be utilized in court. And to the nature of the hole itself that they have excavated out there. Ash, one of the things that was so striking, people have talked about Chad Daybell having worked in the graveyard in the past as a grave digger. This has been talked about extensively. Most graves, as we know, are about 6 feet in depth. It's just part of our vernacular in English. We talk about 6 feet under, that sort of thing. This is a shallow grave. This is not like you can look at the relative height regarding the investigators that are down in this dugout area. This doesn't go down 6 feet. Whatever happened out there was done in kind of a shallow format.
Did you see in any of the photographic evidence any indication that these investigators were going through the fire ring, were going through to see if anything had been burned in there?
As an investigator, I'm going through it. I'm going through every inch of it. And why this is important is because you want to see if there was any attempt, first off, to get rid of any evidence. You want to see if someone had attempted to burn human remains there. So that is something that they would specifically zero in on. And I find it very interesting, Ash, that 2 scene personnel at least were specifically working that area while everybody else was working the excavated area.
Working the firing
Yes.
area.
Yeah.
So it's more than likely they were taking a good close look.
Absolutely. Yeah, I can only imagine. They did have the FBI evidence team that was out there, and they came ready. They didn't show up in a haphazard manner. You can just look at the vehicles out there. They actually had their scene processing vehicles out there. They showed up with this. They were ready to rock and roll.
I think that's probably one of the more distressing parts of the conversation, Vinny, is that those investigators were focusing very significantly on that fire ring. At first, I dismissed it as just being nearby, but then looking closer at the pictures and seeing them having taken those cylinder blocks out, moving the seating, getting right in there. I mean, that's distressing stuff. But it was also, I mean, there you can see that picture right there. You can see it's actually its own little scene as well with those 2 investigators looking at it. It just brings me back to this comment, remember, that we heard in the hearing for Chad Daybell, that one of the sets of remains was egregiously concealed. And all I can think of was that it more than likely could have been that fire ring.
Yeah, and it brings us back to the question of how do they get there? What is the information that they're relying upon? Does it come from a person? Is it digital evidence that they picked up from a phone or an app or a computer somewhere that led them to it? And the other part of this entire investigation of these 2 is that the third wheel, Alex Cox, was clearly part of this crew. I mean, we saw him at the warehouse. We saw his truck at the storage facility as well in Rexburg. So I'm wondering if at any point the 3 of them have to communicate with each other in some way other than in person. And if they did, were investigators able to track that down? Or did someone talk?
Well, I think it's all of the above, Vinny. Honestly, I think all of those are potential, ripe fields to mine at this point. But I keep going back to what our experts told me last night, which is for all of those morons out there who commit crimes and think because they watch forensic files, they know how to do it, and they think they'll burn the remains. It doesn't work that way. It takes hours upon hours upon hours and fuel upon fuel upon fuel. It's not like upwards of 16 to 20 hours to actually reduce human remains down. And even then, it's not complete. And so those who think they can just do it at 4 o'clock in the morning or when the night is darkest are in for a rude awakening. So that leads me to the notion that a fire that's burning that long, potentially, loads of people could have driven by in the number of hours it would have taken. Loads of people could have had a drink of water at 4 o'clock in the morning and thought, what the heck is that fire doing it? Do you see what I'm getting at? There was a potential for a lot of witnesses if, in fact, there was a long fire to try to get rid of remains. And so the witnesses then would be able to help the police saying, I think you need to have a peek-see at that fire pit and then anything nearby, because it's possible that lots of people may have seen something, not to mention Chad Daybell's own children who live there, which is just appalling to think they've been living across from dead children.
It's unreal. It's unreal. Ashley Banfield, thanks so much for bringing Joseph Scott Morgan on the show tonight.
Fascinating.
Really interesting. He's awesome.